Okay, so here's a puzzle for our time. We're living in this era of incredible global connection, right? But at the exact same time, we're seeing this massive surge in nationalist, populist politics. It feels like the world is both shrinking and pulling apart. So why is that? That's what we're going to dig into.
I mean, think about it. The whole promise of globalization was that it would be a rising tide that lifts all boats. More trade, more connection, more prosperity for everyone. But that's not how it's felt for a whole lot of people. So what happened? Why are we seeing this huge backlash?
For a long time, the debate has been framed as this simple whodunit. You've got two main suspects. Suspect number one is economics. People are losing their jobs, their wages are stuck, and they're voting out of pure financial frustration. Suspect number two is culture. People feel like their national identity is under threat from immigration and changing values. But what if that's just the wrong way to look at it?
Yeah, the truth is, it's a lot messier than that. The research suggests these two things, economics and culture, aren't separate suspects at all. They're actually deeply connected. And to see how, we're going to start our investigation with a really crucial clue from a recent election.
Okay, our first big piece of evidence comes from the 2016 US presidential election. And we're not looking at all voters. We're zooming in on this small but incredibly important group that analysts call the switchers. So, who were these people? Well, these are voters who supported Barack Obama in 2012 and then turned around and voted for Donald Trump just 4 years later. Now, these voters are absolutely fascinating because they just don't fit into our neat little political boxes. And that's exactly why their motivations give us this amazing window into what's really going on. Now, check this out. This is where it gets really interesting. If you look at the average Trump voter, their level of financial worry wasn't necessarily off the charts. But the switchers, they reported way higher levels of financial anxiety. For them, the economy was clearly a huge deal.
But wait, it wasn't just about their wallets. When you compare the switchers to other people who voted for Obama in 2012, you see something else. The switchers scored significantly higher on measures of racial hostility. So here's the key point. For this critical group of voters, both economic anxiety and cultural attitudes were firing on all cylinders. And this quote from the economist Dani Rodrik just nails it. He says that these switchers appear to be against all aspects of globalization, trade, immigration, and finance. It wasn't just one thing they were mad about. They were against the whole shebang. So, how do we build a theory out of this? Okay, let's try to make sense of all this. The source material for this explainer lays out a really helpful framework. It gives us 4 distinct ways or pathways that a big shock from globalization can lead to a populist vote. All right, pathway A is the most direct one. You could call it the wallet vote. It's simple. A globalization shock, like a wave of cheap imports, causes real economic pain. People lose their jobs. So what do? They demand protectionist policies, and they vote for the populist candidate who promises to deliver them. Straightforward cause and effect. Now, pathway B is a bit more subtle, but maybe even more powerful. Here, the economic pain doesn't just hurt people's bank accounts, it acts like a trigger. It takes these underlying cultural anxieties, these us versus them feelings, and just cranks up the volume, making voters way more receptive to populist messaging around identity. The next 2 pathways shift our focus from the voters to the politicians, the supply side of politics. So in pathway C, you have politicians who see all this economic frustration bubbling up. And they're smart. They shift their own platforms to be more populist, more anti-globalization, because they see it as a way to win over all those unhappy voters. And finally, pathway D. This one is like a deliberate political tactic. A politician or a party might realize they're losing the argument on economics. So what do? They change the subject. They deliberately stir the pot on cultural issues like immigration or national identity to distract voters and shift the whole conversation away from the economy. Okay, so now we've got our framework with these 4 pathways. Let's put it to the test with some real-world evidence. We're going to start with one of the most studied events in recent economic history, the China trade shock. So starting in the early 2000s, a flood of Chinese imports really hammered certain local manufacturing communities in the US. The economic impact was pretty obvious. Factories closed, jobs disappeared. But the political impact? Well, that's where the story gets really surprising. Now here's the critical finding. In the areas hit hardest by Chinese imports, people didn't actually become more anti-trade. Isn't that wild? Instead, the economic shock seemed to trigger a cultural backlash. Politics got more polarized, and views toward immigrants and minorities hardened. This is like a perfect example of our pathway B, where an economic shock acts as a flashpoint for cultural anxieties.
All right, let's move to our next case file, immigration. This is always a huge one. Is the backlash we see against immigration really about people worrying about losing their jobs to newcomers, or is it driven by something else, a more cultural anxiety?
Well, the evidence here is fascinatingly mixed. A study of immigration to the U.S. about a century ago found the backlash was almost purely cultural. There was no real economic threat, but the hostility was there. Fast forward to modern Europe, though, and you see a much clearer link. There, studies often find that economic competition from new immigrants is directly tied to a rise in support for far-right parties. So it really seems like context is everything.
For our final case file, we're going to look at a part of globalization that sometimes gets left out of these conversations, the free flow of finance, of money across borders.
This is such a great example. Back in the 2000s, lots of people in places like Hungary and Poland took out home loans in foreign currencies, like the Swiss franc, because the rates were better. Seemed like a smart move. But then the 2008 financial crisis hits, their own currencies collapse, and suddenly their mortgage payments go through the roof. And the political results? The areas that got slammed the hardest by this purely financial shock saw the biggest swing in votes toward far-right populist parties.
So we've looked at the clue from the switchers. We've walked through our four-part framework, and we've tested it against trade, immigration, and finance. So after all that, what's the verdict? How do we connect all these dots? The big conclusion isn't economics or culture. The evidence is pretty clear that it's often economics, then culture. Just as a source material puts it, the shocks from globalization are the catalyst, and they very often work through our existing cultural and identity fault lines, making them politically explosive. You know, maybe the best way to think about it is with an analogy. The economic insecurity and anxiety that comes from globalization, that loads the gun. But it's so often the appeals to culture, to identity, to us versus them, that actually pull the trigger and turn all that economic pain into a populist vote. This framework gives us a much more complete way to understand the massive political shifts happening all around us. Which, of course, leaves us with a huge follow-up question. Why does globalization, trade, immigration, finance seem to cause this kind of political firestorm in a way that other big economic changes, like, say, automation, don't seem to? Well, that's a puzzle for another day.